was a clear bullet hole on the right side of his temple. Next to him is an unknown person, and I can just see the blood pouring out of his head. Just the worst thing I've ever seen.
A shocking double murder in a small town funeral home.
It'd been 25 years since we had a homicide. This was something totally new to us. We weren't expecting it.
Was the person paranoid and thought an affair was going on?
A list of suspects, both radical and unusual.
Sometimes people have very extreme beliefs, and that can lead to violence.
In a letter that they sent out, they threatened death.
The truth will be revealed.
The only person that would know this information is the shooter. That is our killer.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. Hudson, Wisconsin, a small, sleepy town on the western edge of the state, bordering the scenic St. Croix River.
Hudson's a small bedroom community. It's kind of a town where everybody knows everybody. People are comfortable with leaving their cars unlocked. They're comfortable with leaving their doors open.
Hudson is also home to the annual Pepperfest.
In the 1950s, there was a large Italian population, and that was the origin of the Pepperfest.
There's a pepper eating contest. Pound of peppers, and if you can do it in about 10 to 15 seconds, you're doing pretty good. There's a Pepperfest royalty. They have a queen, several princesses, and a king.
But on a cold February afternoon, police receive a 911 call that shatters the innocence of this close-knit community forever.
I'll never forget the 911 call. It came in at about 1:40 p.m., and the dispatcher said that there was a shooting at the O'Connell Funeral Home. There are two bodies that have been shot.
The response from law enforcement is swift. Police, ambulances, helicopters, and a SWAT team all descend on the funeral home.
So we had all hands on deck coming to assist because this is a type of call that nobody ever heard over the police radio. It'd been 25 years since we had a homicide in Hudson. This was something totally new to us. We weren't expecting it.
Detectives find the bodies of 39-year-old Dan O'Connell, a funeral home director, and 22-year-old James Ellison, his intern.
Dan O'Connell was one of the most friendly, outgoing, energetic, loving people you could ever meet. He was involved in everything. He was a former North Hudson Pepper King. Everybody loved Dan O'Connell. He was just a stellar individual.
Dan was my soulmate, the love of my life. We were the best of friends, besides being lifelong partners and parents. He was just always compassionate. He could make everybody feel comfortable.
James Ellison was a 22-year-old student who always dreamed about being a funeral director. James had a longtime girlfriend, high school sweetheart, and they had planned on getting married. And he picked O'Connell Funeral Home because he thought, hey, I want to learn from the best.
Tasked with solving the brutal double homicide of Dan O'Connell and James Ellison is rookie detective Sean Petit.
You have to prepare yourself mentally. How am I going to balance my emotions with what I need to get done? In my mind, this is a close personal friend that's murdered. It's time to take a deep breath and look at the big picture. I have to fix this somehow. I owe the family.
Detectives begin their investigation by surveying the crime scene.
Dan is an obvious bullet hole to his head. And next to him is James, hunched over, and he's bleeding, and I can just see the blood pouring out of his head. obviously deceased as well. Both of them, their colors were gone. I've seen a lot of death. I've seen a lot of suicides. I've seen a lot of gunshot wounds. But this was different.
Investigators look for clues to help establish the time of death and a possible motive.
Because the blood was still running down the walls, we knew that this was a relatively fresh crime. We received the call at 1:40 p.m., and we determined that it probably happened within the past 2 hours, so somewhere between 11:40 a.m. and 1:40 p.m. The first question I asked myself was, is this a robbery that went bad? But the office was basically undisturbed. The landline was still in the cradle. There was nothing that appeared out of place in there. No signs of a struggle. And James clearly had his wallet in his left pocket. It was in plain view. So in my mind, I'm thinking, this is something far beyond a robbery gone bad. The bullets were recovered and sent to a crime lab, and we determined that they came from a 9mm weapon. The shell casings that were found on the ground actually told us a lot about the crime scene. We believe that our killer walked into the office, walked right over to the desk, and as Dan is pushing up, getting up off the chair, probably going to say, no, wait a minute, suspect's got a gun, and fires one and hits him right in the head. It appeared that James walked in, saw Dan deceased, and started walking behind the desk over to see him. Then all of a sudden he hears a gunshot, and he dropped his papers and went into a defensive mode. And that's when the third shot came, hit him in the pinky, went through his head, and out his head and into the wall. So now we believe that Dan was shot first and was most likely the original target. James just happened to be an innocent bystander, and he had to be killed because he was a witness. Whoever did this went right in with the sole purpose that I'm going to kill Dan. He didn't have a chance to defend himself. He didn't have a chance to say anything. He just was murdered, point blank.
To catch Dan's killer, detectives will need to unravel the final 24 hours of his life.
Now I'm looking at Dan and saying, okay, wait a minute. What did he do wrong? Is somebody that angry that they're going to kill him?
The first person detectives look at is Dan's widow, Jenny.
One of the toughest things for me is to have to go and ask a lot of the hard questions. I know I have to get personal with Jenny. I need to find out what's going on. What do you know? Are you involved?
Everyone knows that the first person you think of is the spouse. You know, that's who did it. And so I knew that I was number one suspect.
I had to ask Jenny, was there any extramarital affairs? And I assured her that I wasn't going to pass judgment on either one of them. But we had to find out. She said they were happily married, in love. Then I asked her about the life insurance policies. Is she going to benefit hugely with Dan being gone? Is there a motive for her to want him dead? People do things for money. Money talks. It's the power of greed. But she said that life insurance policy was not an extensive amount, nor was it to be paid out immediately. So we didn't believe it was a life insurance issue.
Detectives asked Jenny where she was during the time they believe Dan and James were killed.
This starts the timeline for me. Jenny said that about 7:40 a.m. Dan left for a meeting in Baldwin, Wisconsin. Jenny stayed home until she brought the kids to school about 8 o'clock to 8:15. Because her son's birthday was coming up, she spent the entire morning and afternoon preparing the house for the guests for the birthday party. She told me that she received a phone call from a friend advising her that there was some type of incident at the funeral home. She immediately stopped what she was doing and drove directly to the funeral home. We checked Jenny's alibi, and it was confirmed by friends and neighbors that she was where she said she was.
With Jenny ruled out as a suspect, detectives ask if she knows of anyone who would want to hurt Dan.
I racked my brains because nobody disliked him. Nobody talked bad about him. I had no scenarios going through my head. I had no clue.
Working to fill out Dan's timeline, detectives asked Jenny where Dan was going when he left the house the morning of his death. She tells them he was headed to a meeting with his business partner and brother, Mike.
Now that we've cleared Jenny, we have to take a look at Mike. Mike is operating a funeral home in Baldwin. Dan's operating one in Hudson. Are they arguing? Are they complaining? Is there any kind of hardship between the two of them? Mike agrees to meet in my office, and I ask him, is there any kind of problems between you guys? Mike informed me that both funeral homes were doing very well. There was no financial hardships on either Dan or Mike. In fact, knowing both of them, you couldn't find a closer combination of brothers there. Those two were as tight as a drum.
Detectives asked Mike where he was during the critical time they believed Dan and James were killed.
Mike and Dan were together between 8 o'clock in the morning and 9. Mike did subsequently leave to run some errands in Hudson, and Mike got back to the funeral home in Baldwin about 11:30 a.m., which was confirmed by his secretary. We know that Mike stayed at the funeral home from 11:30 until the time he was notified of the shooting.
With Mike ruled out as a person of interest, detectives turned back to the crime scene, looking for new clues.
We find a calendar in the office, and what was unique about it was there was a appointment at 1 o'clock that Dan had, for whatever reason, bumped back to 2 o'clock. So, what is so important that he had to bump that back? Clearly, he has another meeting with somebody that he has to get taken care of right away. Now we need to figure out who Dan was meeting at 1 o'clock, because that is more than likely our killer.
Detectives are working the theory that the person Dan O'Connell had a 1 p.m. appointment with on the day he was murdered could be his killer. In an attempt to find out who that is, they interview his colleagues.
Dan and the family had a close relationship with St. Pat's, the Catholic Church in Hudson. Father Ryan Erickson was one of the priests at St. Pat's, and because of the funeral home business, they had a working and personal relationship with Ryan Erickson.
Investigators hope that Father Erickson can help them figure out who Dan's 1 p.m. appointment was with.
Father Erickson knew Dan very well. He considered him a friend. They worked a lot of funerals together. I asked him, hey, what do you think happened? Tell me what you know.
And I heard rumors too. Again, these are rumors. You know, you go up to bowling alley, you hear lots of rumors from people, especially when they're drinking a little bit. And, you hear things like, way out there, there's rock.
Father Erickson suggests that Dan might be having an affair with his secretary, Bonnie.
Dan and Bonnie worked very close together. They did a lot together. There were conferences that the two had to attend. So, we need to look, hey, is there an affair going on here? Could Bonnie's husband, Dwayne, be involved? Did he find something out?
Working the theory that Dan O'Connell may have been killed by a jealous husband, detectives bring Dwayne down to the station for questioning.
Dwayne was standoffish. It appeared to me that he was hiding something, that he knew more. I asked Dwayne if he was a jealous husband. He said he did not like the fact that Bonnie had to go to these events with Dan. He thought, you know what? Dan, go by yourself. She needs to be home with the family, with the kids, with me. So he had a little bit of jealousy that she was going on these events with Dan.
Suspicious of Dwayne, they ask him for his alibi on the day Dan was killed.
He's a dairy farmer. And he said, just like every other morning, I get up and I start milking at 5 a.m. After he was done milking, he continued doing chores. About 12 o'clock, he borrowed a friend's truck to run to a supply store. We were able to confirm the fact that he did borrow the truck, and he did return it at approximately 1 o'clock p.m.
Dwayne says he then stayed on the farm because he had a meeting scheduled there at 2 o'clock.
So now we know that he dropped the truck off at 1 o'clock and had a meeting at 2 o'clock. So that gives him a 1-hour window to kill Dan. We know that the homicides occurred somewhere before 1:40 p.m. It's 30 minutes from his farm to the funeral home. It would be almost impossible for him to drive from Baldwin to Hudson, kill 2 people, get back in his vehicle, and get back in the time frame that is basically unaccounted for. We now have to rule Dwayne out because of the time frame. And now we start over from square one. Where do we go from here? We have nothing. Absolutely nothing.
With the investigation hitting a wall, detectives examine the victim's phone records, looking for new clues.
We want to get a tighter timeline. At 1:07, Dan calls an engraving company. Then at 1:22, a call is placed to James's cell phone, but it goes unanswered. So somewhere between 1:07 and 1:22 is what we believe was the time of the crime.
Having narrowed down Dan's time of death to between 1:07 and 1:22 p.m., investigators attend his funeral, looking for new leads that could point to his killer.
I've always advocated that police investigators attend the funeral discreetly, because a suspect, if they attend the funeral, and they frequently will, are there to monitor the investigation. Often their behavior will give them away. They're either too over the top or they're too underwhelmed. Either way, it will stand out and will help you narrow your suspect pool.
The funeral was held in the Catholic Church, and it was standing room only. Hundreds of people standing outside of the church.
It was just amazing how many people came. It was just breathtaking that he had touched that many people. And people would say, you met Dan O'Connell once, you were his best friend for life. That's how he made you feel.
So here I am, mourning the loss of my friend, yet still keeping my eyes and ears open because this case isn't solved. We have nobody. We actually had undercover officers canvass the area, and we ran license plate checks on every single vehicle. Hundreds of vehicles.
But investigators leave the funeral empty-handed.
We have no leads. It's going to go cold. And the frustrating part is, I'm not ready to be done. But I don't have anywhere else to go.
As the case stalls, the FBI contacts the Hudson Police Department with a surprising new lead.
About a month into the investigation, our department received a call from the FBI stating that there's a religious group about an hour and a half east of Hudson called the Rest of Jesus Ministries. And it's kind of a radical group that is against the embalming of bodies. The Rest of Jesus Ministries believe that the body should be wrapped in a shroud and shown as is.
When detectives look into the organization, they learn something alarming.
They sent out over 400 letters to funeral homes in the community or in the area In a letter, they threatened death.
Based upon that pamphlet, we looked at it as a possible motive for a killing.
This changes everything.
Detectives are working a new theory that a religious cult may have targeted funeral home director Dan O'Connell for betraying their beliefs.
The letters appeared threatening in nature, and that is a red flag to me.
Pickling of the body by the draining of the blood is an abomination to me, and this practice must cease. Failure to comply will bring a judgment of much death upon this land.
When I read that letter, I'm thinking this is a radical group that would do almost anything to get their point across. They distributed over 400 pamphlets to various funeral homes, and our department wanted to know if the Hudson Funeral Home, and in particular Dan O'Connell, received a letter from the Rest of Jesus Ministries.
Detectives run a background check on the group's leader, Catherine Padilla.
We found out that she had been arrested twice for disorderly conduct and 2 counts of stalking. To me, she potentially has a motive to commit such crime based upon her past history.
Catherine immediately jumps out in my mind as a viable suspect in that we have this strange ideological fixation, even an obsession. She's part of this anti-embalming cult, and then she has a history of stalker-like behavior. Combine those things, you're talking about someone very obsessive, very committed, someone who can act then very dangerously.
Believing Catherine Padilla could be responsible for a double homicide, detectives traveled to Augusta, Wisconsin to interrogate her.
What we learned from her is that she is the prophet of approximately 25 people consisting of adults and children. She holds these little gatherings at her home every Saturday and talks about biblical scriptures, and she speaks in tongues. To me, that's very odd.
And oftentimes, cult leaders are very charismatic. They draw followers to them. They can influence them into doing what they want. In popular terms, we might call this brainwashing or mind control. But really what it is a coercive process where people manipulate and exploit others to do what they want. Sometimes that ends in violence.
When investigators confront Catherine with the threatening letters she sent to funeral directors, she has a quick answer.
She just said it was simply an expression of her religious belief, and that she isn't going to harm anybody. It's taken out of context.
Suspecting Catherine is lying to them, detectives carry out a search warrant of her home.
We did do a search warrant at Catherine's apartment and seized several documents, including a letter that said prepare for war. As alarming as it sounds, we couldn't find anything to tie her to Dan O'Connell. We asked her where she was on the day of the homicide. She said she was at home giving a sermon. We were able to determine, based upon other interviews, that indeed her time was accounted for several hundred miles away from Hudson.
Having ruled out yet another suspect, leads dry up and the case goes cold.
Waiting for this to come to a conclusion was the worst. It's the looking over your shoulder, I mean, they're going to come after me and my kids. And looking at people differently. Who are my friends? Who can I trust? Do I know this person really? Do I really know who you are? Did you have anything to do with Dan's death? Did you do this? I became very enclosed. And I didn't trust anybody. Because I didn't know.
Deep down, I knew I had to do something. I had a personal interest in this now, unlike any other case that I've ever worked. And I told myself and I told Jenny that I will work it until the day I die. If it means staying another 20 years on the force, we're going to get to the bottom of it.
After 2 years, the families of Dan O'Connell and James Ellison fear their murders may never be solved. Dan's family decides to take matters into their own hands.
Kathy O'Connell, the sister to Dan, reached out to a group of retired homicide detectives, forensic psychologists out of Philadelphia called the VDOC Society. We ended up presenting our case to the VDOC Society, hoping for an answer.
This is precisely what we do, is offer advice and direction and peer review for free on stalled investigations. In many cases, it's just about getting a set of fresh eyes with no existing sort of presumptions or biases to look at something objectively, and you'd be amazed what the results can be.
Richard Walter, a criminal profiler and one of the Society's founding members, agrees to take a look at the case.
Mr. Walter was able to paint a better picture of the crime scene for us. He indicated that this crime showed a lack of emotion. It was very purposeful. The shooter was detached from the victims. He wanted to show power over the victims. This is not an anger retaliatory, a jealous husband, angry co-worker type of situation. You didn't see that multiple shots to the body. You didn't see signs of overkill. This was a power-assertive, cold, calculated killing.
Detective Petit and Richard Walter start from the beginning, digging into the background of all of Dan's close friends and colleagues.
Of the top 10 persons of interest, we were able to rule out 9 of them. There was just one person left that we could not rule out completely, and that was Ryan Erickson. Detectives look deeper into Father Erickson's background and discover something alarming. We learned before he came to Hudson that a college student reported that he had been provided alcohol while he was underage, and that he had been sexually assaulted by Father Ryan Erickson. Just because he's doing these sexual assaults doesn't mean he's a killer, but it gives us an idea of his mental state. If he's committing this type of crime, who's to say he can't commit another further, bigger crime? Detectives track Father Erickson down at the parish, and he agrees to come into the station for an interview. We question him about his actions regarding these sex assaults and the consequences of underage alcohol consumption.
How often did you have him drink with you?
I think maybe 3 or 4 times.
Did he ever become highly intoxicated and get sick?
He did.
Tell me about that.
Well, he got sick, and so I went and I put him into the shower, took his clothes and got his clothes washed, and then brought him back, and then put him to bed.
He pretty much blew it off, stating that he was just trying to teach these kids a lesson on how to drink and how to consume alcohol responsible.
Why would you provide alcohol to somebody underage?
That's what they... When I grew up, that's the kind of thing we did. We had alcohol. It was okay to have that kind of thing. So I've never had that it's evil or bad kind of idea to it.
I'm talking legally.
Yeah,
we have statutes.
Yeah, I understand.
Okay?
Yeah, I have big problem. Yeah.
Who in the right mind would be even remotely saying that they're trying to teach these kids how to be responsible with alcohol? We need to find out where Father Ryan Erickson was on February 5th, 2002, the day Dan and James were killed. He stated at 8 o'clock a.m. he conducted Mass. Between 11:30 and 12:30, he had lunch at the school with the children. And between 12:30 and 1:30, he went back to the church to work on his computer.
This information is important because if it's true and accurate, it shows that he was not at the scene, and so if he has an alibi here, it's important information.
When I asked him what he heard about the homicides, he stated,
I heard that he was shot at his desk. I heard was shot in a doorway.
Do you recall where you heard this from?
I'm not exactly positive, no.
And he stated that he read it in the newspaper or heard it on the news or something to that effect.
In the course of this investigation, never once has anybody from the Hudson Police Department ever mentioned where the bodies were, positions, etc. Nor in the course of this investigation to 1,900 and some people has anybody ever brought up a speculation, a probability, a possibility, or anything like that as far as where the bodies were. Nor has anybody told us how many times they were shot or where they were shot. If that hasn't been brought up in 1,900 some interviews, and out of the course of 5 people in our department that knew exactly that, and not even he knows where that was, why do you know that?
I don't know why I know that.
Or why are you giving us information that this is what you heard?
Well, this is what I have heard. If you ask me a question, I tell you the answer. So if I overheard that and I didn't tell you, then I'd be lying to you.
That was a huge red flag for me, because he just explained in detail the crime scene. That information was never ever released to the public. The only person that would know this information is the shooter.
After revealing details about the murders of funeral home director Dan O'Connell and his intern James Ellison that only the killer would know, detectives zero in on Father Ryan Erickson as their prime suspect in the 2002 double homicide.
For what you're telling us about the scene, not much of that information was given out to the media. None of that was broadcast.
This is the very first we've ever heard of it.
If you're given direct things, Ryan,
I don't know.
Why?
All I know is I may have overheard that.
You're giving us information that was never ever released to the public. You have told us exactly what happened in the funeral home. However, he still denies it.
did you kill Dan?
I did not kill Dan.
Did you want to kill him?
No, I did not. I have no reason to want to kill Dan O'Connell.
One of the last questions I asked him was, if you committed these homicides and knew you could get away with it, would you tell anybody?
If I did it, and I've been living with it for this long, and you guys had me cornered here, I'd break. I tell you, I know I would. And the reason is because I think the guilt would be so overwhelming. I really do.
If you could get away with it, would you tell us?
No. Yeah, I mean, if I could get away with it,
Yes.
probably no. I mean, I try to get away with human nature, so I should try to get away with it.
And I said, if you committed these homicides and knew you were going to get caught, what would you do?
You know, I've thought about suicide before. You know, if I did something that heinous, I'd tell you what, I think I'd be thinking about it now, and I'd be ready to.
But you're not thinking about that?
No, that's not the case.
My reaction when he said he would commit suicide if he was going to get caught was overwhelming. I mean, that's a sin in itself to commit suicide in the eyes of the Catholic Church.
Investigators now have enough circumstantial evidence to request a search warrant.
So we end up conducting a search warrant at his house, and we seize his computer. We found several images of child sex assaults. We located a software device that he put on his computer in an attempt to wipe the hard drive. We located 16 different firearms, and clearly we were most interested in the 2 9mm that he had. Those were sent to the crime lab.
When detectives dig deeper into Father Erickson's computer, it reveals a key piece of evidence.
There was no activity on his computer between 12:30 and 1:30 like he said. We have to wonder now if between 1:07 and 1:22 p.m., Ryan Erickson killed Dan and James.
Having destroyed Father Erickson's alibi, detectives worked to figure out why he would want Dan O'Connell, the town's beloved funeral director, dead. Their questions are answered when a surprising witness comes forward.
Dan had coffee with the bus driver at one of the local stores. And according to her, Dan told her that he had a meeting with Father Erickson later on that day. Dan was concerned about Father Erickson and about his relationship with boys and allegations of touching and that type of thing, which would give us a motive.
Detectives now theorize that Father Erickson was the mysterious 1 p.m. meeting that Dan had booked last minute on the day he was murdered.
Clearly, Dan knew something about Ryan Erickson that he didn't want let out.
Dan was the kind of guy, it's like, go head on. I'm going to talk to you first before I go to the police. But I am going to the police.
Detectives race to the rectory to arrest Father Erickson. They are met by his superior, Deacon Russ Lundgren.
He advised that Ryan Erickson put a rope around his neck, tied it to the balcony, and jumped off and committed suicide. Russ Lundgren found a couple letters on Ryan Erickson's desk. One of them was the last will and testament, and the other was a letter just stating he didn't do it.
I've lived a hard but exciting life. I learned and I taught. I helped people and I hurt them, but I never killed anyone. My ego, my pride, my lust, my envy have always stopped me from being the best person I could be. I am tired.
In this note, he talks about certain characteristics in himself that he's not happy with, even though he denies doing the crime. I see this as kind of a shame-anger cycle, where you blame other people, but then when you have nobody else to blame, you end up blaming yourself.
But what Deacon Lundgren tells detectives next confirms their deepest suspicions.
A few days earlier, Lundgren overheard Father Ryan Erickson slamming his fist on the desk and said, I did it and they're going to get me. And Lundgren peeked his head in the office and said, what are you talking about? And he said, you know what they do to priests in prison? That statement alone is a confession. There's no doubt in my mind that Ryan Erickson killed Dan O'Connell and James Ellison.
Detectives now believe they know what happened in the final hours of Dan O'Connell's life.
He left his home at 7:40 a.m. and met with his brother Mike in Baldwin about 8 o'clock. Around 9 o'clock, Dan leaves the meeting and arrives in Hudson and has coffee with the bus driver about 9:30. Dan told the bus driver that he had a meeting with Erickson between 12:30 and 1:30. At 1:07, Dan calls an engraving company. Sometime between 1:07 and 1:22, Father Ryan Erickson is in the funeral home. He pulled the trigger, killed Dan O'Connell in cold blood. And as he's getting ready to leave, James Ellison just happens to walk through that doorway. And now we have a witness. James was in the wrong spot at the wrong time. And he paid the price.
When detectives tell Jenny that they believe Father Erickson killed her husband and his intern, she's in disbelief.
It shocked the hell out of me. Because that man was in my house hours after he shot and killed Dan and James. He consoled me and my family. He spoke at Dan's funeral. And that was almost as bad as the day that Dan was murdered. Because I trusted that man. He took away my faith in my Catholic Church, and I felt I didn't know anybody. If he could shoot two men in cold blood and go about his life as if nothing happened.
St. Croix County District Attorney Eric Johnson requests a John Doe hearing.
A John Doe hearing is something similar to a grand jury hearing, except for it will not result in charges coming, but it will show that there was a sufficient amount of evidence to find the person guilty of the offense.
After only 20 minutes, the judge rules that Father Erickson was the likely killer.
His findings were that we not only showed probable cause that Father Erickson killed Dan and Jim, but also beyond a reasonable doubt.
The judge came back and said, on a scale of 1 to 10, this case is a 10 out of 10.
He did it. He would have been guilty. And I was like, okay, now it's over. That was closure. I could shut that chapter finally in my life and open up a new one. And that's when I decided to start to live and breathe. Because it was done.
Detectives are finally able to bring closure to the families of both Dan O'Connell and James Ellison.
It felt like a big weight was lifted off my shoulder. Because I know it affected my family. I know it affected the victims. It was just a huge sense of relief that what took 2 years seemed like it took 10.
But the scars still remain after all these years.
I think all the time and memories and things that Dan has missed in the life of the kids. Learning how to drive, going to prom, graduating from high school. He's just missed out on a lot. But we're survivors. And the kids and I, we talk about that a lot. There's nothing we can't survive because we've been to hell and back already.
The heartless murder of a woman restarting her life.
She had at least 10 fractured ribs, fractured larynx, bruising all over her body.
By closing her and making her look like some type of sexual deviant, she is basically humiliating the master of her life.
Forbidden passion leads the ultimate betrayal.
He is being so secretive, he's being so careful to cover his tracks.
Maybe they did have a sexual relationship. Maybe something went wrong. Or was it some unknown subject that we had in our community that enjoyed doing this? Everybody is a suspect.
The truth will be revealed.
She was doing some online dating, and whoever killed her is in her computer, and that'll tell you all you need to know.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. Deer Park, Washington, 20 miles north of Spokane. It's a nature lover's paradise.
It is full of fun things to do, both winter and summer. People come here to take their vacations. It's such a nice town. And so we feel lucky to live here.
It's not overly crowded. People know people still. Everyone knows their neighbor.
Deer Park is a quiet place, and it's not known for violent crimes. Maybe property crimes, some family disputes that we deal with.
But on a chilly December evening, the quiet safety of the town would be violently disturbed. When police get a call from a distraught man looking for his ex-wife, Shannon Starbuck.
He asked for a deputy to respond to her house to do a welfare check. He explained to the deputy that it was totally uncommon for her to take off and be gone for periods of time. Responding deputies walked around the house, looked through the windows, looked for signs of forced entry. Is there some kind of foul play here? At the time, they did not have enough probable cause or reasonable suspicion to enter this residence without a warrant.
The next day, police get another call, this time from her panicked mother.
According to her mother, they spoke at 9 a.m. in the morning on a daily basis. And it had been 2 mornings that they had not spoken. And that prompted officers to respond again. They were able to obtain a key, and they made entry at that time and discovered the body.
Detectives Mike Ricketts and Lyle Johnston of the Spokane County Sheriff's Office rushed to the scene.
There was no signs of a break-in. I didn't see anything obvious within the living room. When I entered the master bedroom, here is this white female that's in her mid-30s or so, laying on the bed.
She was laying on her back, face up. She had bruising near her neck area and some bruising around her facial area. The bruising itself would indicate to me that she was beat. There were no knife wounds. There were no gun wounds. I considered it a possibility that it was suffocation or strangulation. There was a robe that was kind of awkwardly placed on her. There was a massage vibrator type of device that people would use to massage their muscles that was wrapped inside of that robe, awkwardly. Not like she had done that. She was posed that way.
Detectives confirm the woman is 42-year-old Shannon Starbuck.
Shannon was a lovely, vivacious woman. She was married to a man named Clay, and they had recently become divorced.
Now, they had 5 children. 2 older boys lived with Clay, and the 3 younger, the 2 girls and the youngest son, lived with Shannon.
She was vibrant. She was beautiful. She was kind. She was also going back to school. At that time, she was restarting her life.
Who would break into the home of a lovely woman, the mother of 5 children, and do such a horrible thing to her? This was something savage. It scared the community.
To catch her killer, detectives will need to piece together the last 24 hours of Shannon Starbuck's life. They start by processing the crime scene.
I didn't find any sign of a struggle inside the bedroom. We collected DNA swabs from her neck and under her fingernails. All of the blankets from the bed were inside the wash machine, which was just right outside the master bedroom door. And the front of the wash machine had been completely wiped down. Again, appears to be some type of cleanup of the crime scene to hide any potential evidence that may have been left on the bed by the suspect. At the foot of the bed is what appears to be a safe. And inside there are several sexual toys that are staged in a way so that they could be obviously seen from anyone who's walking past.
Detectives start working up a profile on Shannon's killer.
By posing her and making her look like some type of a sexual deviant, she is basically being humiliated after the end of her life. This would appear to be someone that has some type of a vendetta against Shannon to take this much time and effort to make her look this bad.
Is it somebody that was close to her, that knows her, that was angry with her, wanted to get back at her? Or was it some unknown subject that we had in our community that enjoyed doing this?
The first person detectives want to speak with is Shannon's ex-husband, Clay Starbuck.
Oftentimes in these type of investigations, we're going to look at the domestic partner or the ex.
I met Clay, and I said, "Hi, I'm Detective Dressback. I understand you have some questions." He said, "Yeah. I want to know what's going on. Nobody will tell me anything." I said, "You don't know what happened?" He said, "No, nobody will tell me anything." So I said, "Well, I'm sorry, but your wife was found dead in her bedroom." And he just collapsed on the floor. And it's prudent and appropriate as an investigator to give them room to react in whatever fashion they're going to react. At one point, he even excused himself, went into the bathroom, and I could hear him heaving like he was throwing up. Like this was very traumatic to him.
After Clay gets over the shock of Shannon's death, detectives ask him when he last saw his ex-wife.
Clay Starbuck had told us that he had a small car that didn't run very well. So on the day in question, he starts the car up. He drives it around this community area where he lives in Deer Park. And it stalls approximately 2 to 3 blocks from Shannon Starbuck's house.
I was cranking and trying to start it. It didn't start. And I texted Shannon and said, car quit, can you take the kids? And she texted me and said, okay. And so she took the kids to school. So I walk home.
He gets back to his house and then he goes to sleep because his back is hurting. And at that time his phone must have died because the battery wasn't charged.
Clay says he went back to work on his car from 11:10 a.m. until 3:30 p.m., returning to his home a number of times during the day to get more tools.
2:45 p.m., the children were out of school and texted Shannon asking where she was, who's going to pick me up.
Shannon was supposed to go to the school and pick up the children, and she doesn't arrive.
In the late afternoon, while his phone was dead, Clay says he missed a number of texts.
3:17 p.m., Shannon texted Clay asking if he could pick up the kids. And that was the last text from her phone that afternoon.
She says something like, I just got up. Can you get the kids? But my phone wasn't on. And so Austin left work and picked up the kids.
Clay wasn't worried at that point because he thought he would see Shannon later that night.
There was a basketball game one of the oldest sons was playing in at the high school that evening. And Shannon usually would show up at those games, however, she wasn't there that night.
I sent Shannon a couple texts just saying, get a hold of us.
After the basketball game, Clay and the kids went to Shannon's house.
We walked around the house. I've walked around the house with the kids with a flashlight, looking in there Thursday night.
Okay. And then what happened?
Well, we went back to my house.
Okay.
And the kids kept trying to call Shannon, and I think I sent her another text. On Friday, I sent her a text and said, if we don't hear from you by 7 p.m. tonight, I'm going to call and have the sheriff find you.
Detectives are now able to narrow down the window of time that Shannon was murdered.
Shannon's death probably occurred somewhere on December 1st after 3:17 p.m. and sometime before December 2nd around 9 a.m.
She had a routine of talking to her mother at a specific time in the morning, and that phone call doesn't come. So we begin to operate under the assumption that she was deceased by that particular time.
Investigators check Clay's cell phone records. It corroborates what he told investigators.
He was cooperative during the interview. and he provided a DNA sample voluntarily.
With his alibi having checked out, they ask Clay who he thinks might have wanted to hurt Shannon in such a brutal way.
The thing that he kept saying was, look at her computer, and that'll tell you all you need to know. He said she was doing some online dating, and whoever killed her is in there.
Detectives are working a theory that whoever murdered Shannon Starbuck could be connected to her online dating. They start by scouring her phone, looking for recent communications.
One of the first ones that came up was a guy by the name of Tom. And Tom had sent her some text messages that very day. Tom and Shannon had been flirting back and forth, and it was obvious that they're attracted to one another.
As they continue reading the texts, alarm bells sound.
Tom is encouraging Shannon to send him some kind of racy pictures, and one of the pictures that he asked for is very similar to the pose we find Shannon's deceased body in.
Is this a coincidence? How is this possible?
That threw up red flags for us. We're thinking he is our suspect.
They track Tom down by calling the number on Shannon's phone.
When we first talked to Tom, we went to his residence. Tom told us he met Shannon through a dating application. They had met, they had communications on the phone and via text. They had not been intimate.
Detectives asked Tom to account for his whereabouts during the time they believe Shannon was murdered.
Tom Walker told us that he left from work approximately 9:40 a.m. to go to a funeral. And then he returned to work around 10:50 a.m. He said that he had texted her about going to the funeral and asked her how her day was going. She subsequently responded to him a little while later, around 12, asking if he would like to meet her for lunch at that time. She thought it was odd because she knew that he had a funeral to attend to and that he would be at work and would not be able to meet on December 1st. We were able to investigate that and totally corroborate everything he told us. His boss eliminated him by verifying when he was at work, when he went to the funeral, when he came back, and how late he worked that evening. He was nowhere near Shannon's residence on December 1st. Tom also provided us with a DNA sample voluntarily. His DNA was not found on Shannon Starbuck in the place of the injuries.
So we were able to rule Tom out in the death of Shannon Starbuck.
Still believing Shannon's dating history is the key to finding her killer, detectives delve deeper into her personal life.
Similar to going to a bar, for instance, to meet people and not knowing them. Online, you're also potentially connecting with people you don't know. And there is some research to suggest that online dating behavior is associated with increased risk of violence.
So sometime shortly after noon, Shannon text messages the guy by the name of John and appears to be setting up some type of a rendezvous for later in the evening on the same day as her death.
Detectives set to work finding John Wilson.
We were able to take the photograph off of John's Facebook account, run it through the open source search engine, and we were able to match that photograph with a doctor out of Maryland. Once we contacted that doctor, we were able to verify that that wasn't really a picture of John, and John is just an unknown person who's faking these profiles for the purposes of dating multiple women.
I think 50% of people or more report lying about their profiles or information online. So it begs the question, who are you talking to?
John's fake online persona leads detectives to theorize that he is somehow involved in Shannon's murder.
He's difficult to find, and he's already being untruthful about his identity. He seems to have disappeared into the wind the moment that Shannon Starbuck is murdered. So we thought John is our guy because he is being so secretive. He's being so careful to cover his tracks. We reached out to John directly. I sent him both an email and messaged him saying, you need to contact the police. So when John calls me, he is very skeptical. Sounds like he can't really believe that the police are reaching out to him. But I inform him that I'm investigating the death of Shannon Starbuck. His first reaction was that he wanted to consult with an attorney.
When you see a suspect immediately lawyer up, as they say, and engage their attorney, it doesn't necessarily point to guilt, but it points to them having something to hide.
Detectives ask for the man's real name, but he refuses to give it to them.
And at that time, I scribbled out a quick note saying, hey, tell him he's got 20 seconds, tell us who he is, identify himself, or we're going to put his photograph out on the media everywhere to find out who he is.
It's called offering the out. And this is frequently where we see they'll cop to something that they wouldn't normally confess to because it's a preferred alternative to what's being insinuated.
At that point, John does give me his true identity, and we make an arrangement to meet the following day with his attorney.
Detectives finally come face to face with their prime suspect, John Kenline.
And so John did lay out the fact that he is married, he has a job that is kind of respected in the community, and yet he's leading this double lifestyle of meeting up with multiple women. And so he doesn't want this to be known. He feels that he's got a lot to lose, potentially his job, his marriage, his own children, his house. Everything is riding on the line. Yet at the same time, he realizes the predicament he's in. He's the number one suspect in a homicide, so it all has to come out.
If somebody is willing to cheat or lie to their family, they're probably willing to lie to investigators.
Detectives asked John where he was during the time they believe Shannon was murdered.
He told us that he dropped his kids off at school that morning and that he had plans to see Shannon approximately 10:30 a.m. in Deer Park. He drove up to Shannon's house, and there was no answer.
He admits that he's been there at the house. He's made phone calls on the day that she is murdered. Everything puts him in the area.
Detectives suspect John Kenline knows more than he's letting on.
What crossed my mind was maybe they did meet up, and maybe they did have a sexual relationship. Maybe something went wrong. We suspected that John was our killer.
Detectives have zeroed in on John Kenline as the prime suspect in the murder of Shannon Starbuck.
John told us he drove up to Shannon's house, and there was no answer. So he utilized some public phones in the Deer Park area, and he tried to call her, still didn't get any answer. He actually drove back to her house, still no sign of Shannon. Nobody answered the door. He also went around the house knocking on windows and that. There was still no answer.
After he left, Kenline claims he finally heard from Shannon. She texted saying she was out for lunch and was sorry she missed him.
So sometime shortly after noon, Shannon text messages John and appears to be setting up some type of a rendezvous for later in the evening, making plans for that night.
So John went back that evening and tried to meet up with her, and there was no answer.
Detectives are suspicious of John's story.
His own alibi put him at the house during that time frame when Shannon was murdered.
There could be a variety of motivations that John would have in showing up at her house. It could be that she was about to expose him for the charlatan and the fraud that he was. It could be that he felt she had ghosted him, and how dare she. It could be that he just wanted to take the relationship to the next level, and then found when he was there that, in fact, his fantasies were more twisted, maybe than even he knew.
There's just one problem.
At the time, John did provide us with a DNA sample, which we tested along with other samples, and he was eliminated as a contributor to DNA.
The fact John's DNA is ruled out doesn't necessarily mean he's not the killer. Every alibi should be independently corroborated through some secondary source.
John seems to be our number one suspect. He's just not admitting to having been in the house or having direct contact with her. We still had a lot of investigation to do before we could rule him out.
With John stonewalling them, the investigation hits a wall.
I think it did shock the people of Deer Park as well as the Spokane community. A mother of 5 children murdered inside her own home. No apparent signs of forced entry. Did she answer the door and someone forced her way in? That type of incident without answers scares people.
We had a very serious threat on the streets for the community at large. And that was very stressful for me at the time, because I didn't want to miss anything. I wanted to make sure we covered all of our bases and that we were headed in the right direction.
But soon, their hard work pays off.
We always request records directly from the cell phone provider. And in this case, when I was able to get records for Shannon Starbuck's phone, I was able to go through them, and I found a 911 call that was not listed in her call records on her phone. Some cell phones actually mask 911 calls, and that would be if you were a victim and you called 911, as soon as you hang up, the suspect wouldn't be able to grab your phone and see that you had called. So it's kind of a safety feature.
The discovery of the 911 call rocks the investigation.
And I can actually remember standing up at my desk and announcing to all the other detectives in the room, she called 911, and it was extremely exciting. We're working on the premise that Shannon died somewhere in a 24-hour time span. So looking at those phone records, it timestamps 9:17 in the morning as the time that this event is taking place. We're able to verify that with 911, and it was an oh my gosh moment of we really know when this happened now.
To me and the other investigators, that indicated that that was the time she was attacked.
911, what are you reporting?
And she was killed shortly thereafter.
Hello?
Obviously, this revelation is shocking, and the fact that investigators are hearing this for the first time, I mean, this was under their noses all along. She was essentially in the throes of death.
Detectives have learned that Shannon Starbuck called 911 in distress in the early morning of December 1st, the day she was killed.
So we were unaware up until weeks into the investigation that she had ever called 911. But once we saw it in the phone records, I was able to contact the 911 dispatch center, have them pull the records for that specific date and time, and they found a recording that they didn't know existed.
911, what are you reporting?
When you listen to the recording, you can hear a grunt and a muffled noise in the background that sounds like someone possibly being assaulted.
911, what are you reporting? Hello?
It was eerie in the sense that you knew this is a struggle that's going on and this person's fighting for their life, and it doesn't turn out well. The 911 receiver actually talks at the exact same time that that noise is in the background.
911, what are you reporting?
And it would be my belief that he probably talked over it and didn't realize that there was anyone on the end. He did call the phone number immediately back, but there was no answer. It goes to voicemail because the phone has been shut off or disabled by this time.
Hi, this is Shannon. Please leave a message.
And therefore, there is no further contact.
Almost without exception, in every jurisdiction, 911 hang-up calls are at least a one-officer dispatch.
Would it necessarily have stopped what was occurring? Not likely, but maybe perhaps her killer could have been found much earlier.
The discovery of the 911 call sends the investigation into a whole new direction.
Initially, it appeared that Shannon was most likely alive in the afternoon of December 1st. She's texting to multiple people, both Tom, John, Clay at some point, and the kids as well.
Detectives now believe it was likely Shannon's killer, trying to pretend Shannon was still alive.
Your scope of possible suspects really starts to slim down because now you can check out their alibis and know whether or not it is possible for them to have been involved or not.
With the new evidence, detectives take another look at their prime suspect, John Kenline.
We discovered that at 9:20 he's taking the kids to school. So to me, that's pretty closely ruling John out as being involved in getting back and forth between those locations with the amount of time it would take to go from Spokane to Deer Park. I am now convinced John Kenline was not involved in the murder of Shannon Starbuck.
This is a case that would be and has been extraordinarily frustrating for investigators in that you have some pretty specific crime scene behaviors and a puzzling scene and a number of viable suspects, and nothing is shaking out. The unanswered questions are going to keep you up at night.
After ruling out John Kenline in the murder of Shannon Starbuck, detectives go back to the drawing board.
We're looking at saying, okay, somebody got on her phone and was communicating with John Kenline, was communicating with Tom Walker, was returning messages.
Detectives do a deeper dive into Shannon's personal life and make an alarming discovery.
While I'm talking to the friends of Shannon, they are informing me that Clay has been nothing but trouble for Shannon. He has harassed her, he has done damage to her place, he has done damage to her vehicle, he has threatened her.
He owes her a significant amount of child support. He's a very much controlling person. He's not happy with the fact that she's dating other men, that he has no control over her, and he has been stalking and harassing her for some time.
When it's learned that Clay has been stalking Shannon, it's particularly troubling to me as a psychologist. We know from the research in intimate partner homicides that when stalking is involved, it increases the risk 2 to 3 times that somebody is going to end up murdered.
We discovered she was so concerned about Clay stalking her essentially that she did ask for and receive a domestic violence protection order.
Tragically, the use of restraining orders like we see in this case, it's a piece of paper. The existence of that paper is actually seen by the offender as a voucher to actually act on what they've already been planning. It actually infuriates and escalates their behavior to the point that it has the opposite of the desired effect.
She had told individuals in the community that if something happened to her, if she was harmed or killed, that it was Clay Starbuck that had done it to her.
Based on these new revelations, detectives take a second look at Clay Starbuck.
So Clay had given us a story about his vehicle breaking down and how he had sent some text messages to Shannon to try to get her to take the children to school. And then after his car broke down, he went back to his house and fell asleep. Somewhere in there, he said that his cell phone battery died and his cell phone was off for a majority of the day. And that in itself wasn't contradictory to anything we found in the cell phone records. His phone was actually off for a majority of the day. But when we examine cell phone records frequently, we don't look at just a very small, frequent time frame because people live and breathe on their cell phones in this day and age. You develop patterns. So for Clay Starbucks, over a 1-year total of cell phone records were obtained. And what we were able to see was that at no other time over the preceding year has his phone ever been off for the amount of time that it was off on the day that Shannon Starbuck was murdered. He had never, in the prior year, had text messages sent to him that he didn't respond to in a timely fashion, or go for periods of time where there was no activity. Yet, on the day of Shannon Starbuck's murder, all of those things happened.
Detectives meet with Clay, testing his alibi against the new timeline.
We ask him to go for a little ride with us to show us the route that he drove and where his vehicle broke down and how he walked back to his house, which he agreed to do. Now, this is a golf course community, and there are actually greens in between some of these residences. And where the vehicle stalled is across from one of these greens that goes in between these houses and would have been the most likely direct route to walk back to his house. And in this particular December, there isn't a lot of snow. There wasn't anything really impeding someone from taking that route. But Clay insists that he walked down the sidewalk and stayed off of the golf green, at which point he turns and goes east through the neighborhood back to his own residence. We follow this route, and we specifically look for home security cameras, and we find one. We contact the homeowners and ask them if we can look at their security footage, and after looking at the footage numerous times, we cannot once find Clay Starbuck walking past this residence that he claims he walked past 4 times on that day. I question him on this at least 2 to 3 times. Are you sure this is the route you've taken? And he is adamant that that's the route he's taken. And now, after looking at the footage from the surveillance video, it's obvious that Clay Starbuck isn't being truthful with us about where he was and what he was doing.
Detectives have now shifted the focus of their investigation in the murder of Shannon Starbuck to her ex-husband, Clay, when a surprising piece of evidence emerges.
DNA that was identified as belonging to male Starbuck lineage was found in the area where Shannon was strangled and suffocated. So it wasn't DNA just found on a ledge or an item of clothing or something that had been there for a while. This was DNA that was found on Shannon Starbuck, where she was injured, part of the cause of her death.
In order to link the killer's DNA left on Shannon's body to Clay, detectives must prove it belongs to him and not one of his sons.
We were able to eliminate the adult male Starbuck children because one of them was at school during that day and the other one was at work. That left us with Clay Starbuck as being the provider of the DNA on Shannon Starbuck.
Closing in on their killer, detectives bring Clay Starbuck down to the station to confront him with the damning evidence.
Clay Starbuck agreed to be interviewed. He waived his rights, so we proceeded with a recorded interview with him.
Part of how we got here today, Clay, is the fact that all of the evidence has lined up to show that you have not been truthful with us to this point. All of the evidence is lined up to show that you were there at the house on that particular day that Shannon died.
Is that no? I can't hear you. No? Now, don't sit here and tell me you weren't there, because we have the proof that you were there. Okay?
I've been in that house probably 30 times.
Okay, it's not about the house.
It's not about the house, and
it's not about the house. How did your DNA get on her neck and her face and under her fingernails?
say my DNA was there under her fingernails and around her mouth. I don't have any scratches or bruises. You guys looked at me for that. I didn't do that.
I said, I understand that, Clay, but let me go get something. I went and grabbed the lab report, and I showed it to him.
This is the laboratory report that indicates your DNA is under her fingernails, is on her neck, and on her face.
I hear what you're saying. I just have a problem believing it.
Your DNA is there because you murdered Shannon.
He started breathing heavy. He was almost hyperventilating.
I'm not doing very well right now.
You're not doing very well because you're under arrest for murder. I agree with you. You're not doing very well right now.
At that point, he shut down. He didn't make any more statements.
Detectives arrest Clay Starbuck and charge him with the murder of his wife, Shannon.
Sadly, Shannon's fatal mistake was daring to start a new life without Clay. And it really drove him crazy. Clay killed Shannon, I think, because he was jealous and he did not want to have to pay her child support every month. And at the time of the murder, he owed her more than $9,000. And so it appears that Clay decided that he could get out of these financial problems by simply killing her.
Detectives now believe they know what happened to Shannon Starbuck in the last hours of her life.
December 1st, around 8 a.m., Clay text messages Shannon, asked her to take the children to school. Most likely during the time frame that she's away from the house, taking the children to school, Clay has snuck into the house and he lays in wait for her while she is going about her morning routine.
While Clay is waiting for Shannon to return home, he turns off his cell phone.
Shortly after getting back to the house, he attacks her. She attempts to call 911, but that call is cut short.
911, what are you reporting?
And her phone is turned off, and then he murders her through a struggle, strangulation. He positions her in a humiliating fashion for the rest of the community to be aware of after the fact, and makes her look like the bad person because she's doing some online dating and things that he doesn't necessarily approve of.
After she was attacked, I believe Clay got on her phone and on her computer and started looking through it and communicating back with these individuals, trying to frame either Tom Walker or John Kinline as being the ones that committed the murder.
Clay then returns home, turns on his cell phone, and waits for his kids to get home from school.
Clearly, this festering jealousy had led him to the point where he was prepared to commit murder, but at the same time, he was able to keep things under control and keep his behavior premeditated and organized enough that he uses these texts to artificially engineer this alibi.
Detectives also believe that Clay texted himself from Shannon's cell phone to fool police into thinking she was still alive for most of the day on December 1st.
For me, I also wonder, is there an element of sadism here? Is there a deeper quality to him that really wants to have Shannon experience pain and suffering?
Clay Starbuck is found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Clay definitely planned this out. There was a significant amount of premeditation, and I think that someone that can be that calculating and that terrible to any other human being, spending the rest of his life in prison is definitely what he deserved.
It's horrendous, but not just because of what happened to Shannon. It's what it did to this family. When Clay Starbuck killed Shannon, he robbed their children of their mother, and then because of his life sentence, he robbed his children of a father. It was a selfish act based in greed and jealousy. And it just didn't have to happen.